Sometimes the people who look the toughest end up having the gentlest hearts. And on a quiet stretch of highway just outside Amarillo, Texas, a single moment proved exactly that. When a line of roaring motorcycles suddenly skidded to a stop in the middle of traffic, drivers braced for the worst. But none of them could have imagined that what those bikers were about to do would restore hope in every person who witnessed it. Before we get into this unbelievable story, make sure to subscribe for more real stories that touch the heart and shake the soul. On an early autumn afternoon when the warm Texas sun was slowly settling behind the open plains, traffic along Route 287 moved in its usual rhythm, steady but relaxed. The kind of highway where people looked ahead at miles of open road and felt their thoughts quiet down. Among the drivers that day was a man named Daniel Mercer, a 46-year-old mechanic from Oklahoma City traveling home after helping his sister with some home repairs. His old gray pickup hummed steadily beneath him, and though he was tired, he felt satisfied. He had left early to beat the evening rush, but something deep inside told him this drive would be memorable for reasons he could not yet understand. A few cars ahead of Daniel rode a group of bikers, 15 in total, the kind of group that made most drivers instinctively straighten up at the wheel. Their leather jackets carried patches and symbols unfamiliar to most, and their rumbling bikes echoed like thunder across the open highway. Drivers kept their distance. Some whispered assumptions, others snapped quick photos. The bikers rode in a disciplined formation, steady, confident, powerful. No one knew their names, no one knew their stories, and no one could have predicted how unexpectedly gentle their hearts were. The trouble began near mile marker 118. A long line of cars slowed, then hesitated, then began braking one by one. Daniel narrowed his eyes and leaned forward over the steering wheel. Something was happening up ahead. Drivers were swerving slightly into the left lane, some irritated, some curious. At first it looked like debris scattered across the highway. But as Daniel approached, he realized it was no debris at all. A man was struggling to cross the road with a small cart barely held together with duct tape and frayed rope. The cart tipped with every step he took. A gust of wind pushed it off balance again, and the man stumbled. He caught himself clumsily, dropping a few items that rolled across the concrete. He was elderly, maybe in his 70s, with a bent posture and thin gray hair that shook in the wind. He wore a faded red flannel shirt and jeans torn at the knee. His shoes looked worn enough to tell a lifetime of stories. Even from a distance, his exhaustion was obvious. He was limping, dragging the cart behind him like it weighed far more than his frail body could handle. Some drivers honked with annoyance, swerving around him. Others simply stared and moved on. A few shook their heads as if his struggle was an inconvenience to their day. Daniel felt a sting of sympathy rise in his chest. He considered pulling over, but the traffic was tight and he was gliding in the center lane. His hands tightened on the wheel. Someone should help, but like many on that road, he hesitated for a moment too long. Everything changed in the next 10 seconds. The group of bikers ahead suddenly slowed, their brake lights flashing in one synchronized sweep. The leader, a tall man with a dark helmet decorated in silver stripes, raised his arm, signaling the entire pack. Then, without a moment's hesitation, all 15 motorcycles came to a controlled stop right in the middle of the two-lane highway. Tires screeched behind them as confused drivers pressed their brakes. Some honked, others yelled. The bikers didn't flinch. The leader dismounted his bike and jogged toward the elderly man, his boots thumping against the pavement. The others spread out in a protective formation, slowing incoming cars, gesturing for them to stop or move carefully around. Daniel watched in disbelief. People didn't do this. Not on a busy highway, not in broad daylight, and definitely not a group of bikers who everyone assumed were dangerous. The elderly man tried to apologize as the biker leader approached him, but his breath came in short, wheezing puffs. His thin hands trembled around the handle of the cart, which now leaned awkwardly on one broken wheel. The biker leader gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Even though the roaring engines behind them were loud, the sudden quiet between those two men felt like a small pocket of stillness in the chaos of the highway. The biker leader knelt down to gather the scattered items. Daniel saw canned food, a folded blanket, and a framed photograph with cracked glass. The leader placed everything back into the cart carefully, almost tenderly, as if the items were priceless. He examined the broken wheel, shook his head, and whistled sharply toward his group. 2 bikers jogged over, one with a small tool kit strapped to his back. As they knelt beside the cart, working quickly to fix the wheel, the leader continued talking with the elderly man. Though Daniel could not hear their voices, he could feel the sincerity in their gestures. Traffic had now backed up for nearly half a mile. Drivers leaned out their windows, some annoyed, others confused, but most were beginning to understand that this wasn't a disturbance. It was something meaningful, something rare. Daniel finally edged close enough to see more clearly. The elderly man's face was sunken, his cheeks hollow. His eyes looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, the kind of tired that came from loss, from loneliness, from years of trying to survive. The leader of the bikers introduced himself as Mason. His voice carried a calm authority that seemed to put the elderly man at ease. Behind them, the two bikers had already fixed the wheel using metal clamps and spare bolts from their toolkit. But the cart was still too heavy for the elderly man to pull. Mason stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said something that made the elderly man's lips quiver. Then Mason lifted the cart himself, testing its weight. He motioned to his group. In seconds, two bikers walked to the shoulder of the highway and began clearing a path. Another three directed traffic, guiding frustrated drivers with surprisingly patient gestures. A moment later, Mason gently placed his hand on the elderly man's back and guided him toward the shoulder. The rest of the bikers formed a shield behind them, blocking cars and creating a safe passage. Daniel felt his throat tighten. This wasn't just kindness. This was protection, respect, humanity at its best. But the day was far from over, and the story had only begun to unfold. Once they reached the shoulder, the elderly man sat on a patch of dry grass, his thin legs shaking. Mason handed him a bottle of water from his motorcycle's side compartment. The man drank slowly, as if each sip brought back a bit of life. After a few quiet moments, he finally spoke. His name was Walter Hayes. He had lost his wife 3 years earlier to a sudden illness. His home had burned down in a winter electrical fire he couldn't afford to repair. Since then, he had drifted from one temporary shelter to another, unable to settle anywhere. He was now traveling to Wichita Falls to meet a distant cousin who had offered him a place to stay for a few months. But the bus he was supposed to take had been canceled due to scheduling issues. He didn't want to bother anyone, so he walked. He had already walked 14 miles. The bikers listened silently, their faces softening with every detail. People assumed bikers were rough, unapproachable, maybe even dangerous. But in that moment, every one of them stood with the empathy of someone who had seen struggle before. Mason looked at his group, a silent understanding passing between them. Then he made a decision. They were not going to let Walter walk another step alone. When Mason announced that they would escort him all the way to Wichita Falls, Walter's eyes filled with tears. He covered his face with his trembling hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected compassion. Mason gently lowered the hands from Walter's face and gave a reassuring nod. But then something happened that none of them expected. A state trooper car pulled up behind the group, lights flashing. The officer stepped out, hand resting near his holster. Someone had reported a gang blocking traffic, he said. His tone was sharp, suspicious. He approached them with a mix of caution and authority, scanning the scene. The tension thickened. The officer asked for identification. Mason calmly handed over his ID, explaining the situation, but the officer seemed unconvinced. He glanced at the 15 large motorcycles, the patched jackets, the traffic backup stretching down the road. His instincts told him to distrust the situation. Daniel, who had now parked his truck on the shoulder, stepped forward. He explained what he had seen. So did another driver and another. More and more witnesses spoke up, describing how the bikers protected Walter, fixed his cart, and stopped traffic only to save his life. The officer's posture softened slightly, though he remained cautious. Finally, he approached Walter directly. The elderly man repeated his story, voice cracking as he described the long miles he had walked. The officer's stern expression slowly changed to one of understanding, then regret. He apologized for the misunderstanding. Then, unexpectedly, he offered something more. He radioed for permission to use a nearby emergency transport van that the department sometimes used for stranded civilians. Within minutes, the van arrived. The trooper insisted on driving Walter himself, ensuring he made it safely to Wichita Falls. The bikers exchanged surprised glances. Mason placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, thanking him sincerely. The officer nodded, almost sheepishly, admitting he had misjudged the situation. Walter hugged Mason tightly, tears soaking into the biker's leather jacket. Mason returned the embrace with surprising gentleness. The rest of the bikers offered their own final gestures, a handshake, a pat on the back, a nod of respect. The officer helped Walter into the van, securing his cart in the back. As Walter waved through the window, the bikers formed a line on either side of the van, revving their engines in a unified, thunderous farewell. It wasn't noise. It was a salute. Traffic slowly resumed as the officers guided vehicles onward. The bikers mounted their motorcycles and rode together into the distance, disappearing over the horizon like a moving symbol of unexpected heroism. Later that night, Daniel couldn't get the image out of his mind. Tough-looking bikers stopping in the middle of a highway to help a stranger. People judging them by appearance, only to witness the purest act of compassion. A police officer who began with suspicion but ended with humility and kindness. And an elderly man who, after so much loneliness, finally found hope again because a few strangers refused to look away. The story spread. Drivers posted videos online. Witnesses wrote about it. And soon, all across the country, people were talking about the day a group of bikers stopped traffic just to help a struggling stranger. Not for attention, not for praise, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And somewhere in Wichita Falls, Walter sat on a clean bed for the first time in months, holding the framed photo of his late wife. He whispered thanks to the wind, believing that kindness still existed, that compassion still lived in people's hearts, even in the most unexpected forms. And miles away, Mason and his group rode under the wide Texas sky, unaware that they had become heroes in the stories of people they'd never meet. But they didn't need the praise. They didn't need the recognition. They just needed the open road, their shared brotherhood, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the toughest people carry the softest hearts. Thank you for listening. Now tell me, from which part of the country are you watching this video?